He drove himself to the emergency room with his thumb pressed into the hole in his own neck. Not because anyone told him to, because he figured out in the first few seconds after the explosion that it was the only way to stay alive long enough to get there. That man is Scott DeShields Jr., the former Kentucky State Trooper who built one of the most watched firearms channels on the internet under the name Kentucky Ballistics. And the story of what really happened to him and what he built after surviving it is not the story most people think they know. By the end of this video, you will understand how the worst day of Scott's life became the thing that changed his channel forever, and why over 1 billion people have now watched what he does next. Before Kentucky Ballistics existed, Scott DeShields Jr. was a cop, not a hobbyist with a badge, a working law enforcement officer who moved through multiple departments across western Kentucky over the better part of a decade. He started with the Murray Police Department in 2012. He was good at the work. In 2015, he received the Crisis Intervention Training Officer of the Year award for his region, a recognition given to officers who demonstrate exceptional skill in handling individuals in mental health crisis. That is not a ceremonial award. It means the people around him trusted him in situations where the wrong move gets someone killed. He graduated from the Kentucky State Police Academy in November 2016. From there, he moved to the Benton Police Department in 2018. He was, by any reasonable measure, building a career in law enforcement that could have lasted 30 years. But the YouTube channel had already been running since May 2010. That detail matters more than it might seem. Scott did not quit his job to start a channel. He built the channel while keeping the job, filming on weekends, testing guns, developing a voice, figuring out what worked, for years before the audience grew large enough to make a choice. When people talk about overnight success in this space, what they usually mean is that they weren't watching the long part. Scott spent the better part of a decade doing both things at once before anyone outside the firearms community paid much attention. The channel's original format was straightforward. Scott had guns, Scott knew guns, and Scott could explain guns. That was the pitch. A former law enforcement officer with real-world experience putting rifles and calibers through their paces. It was credible. It was clean. And it was, for a while, exactly what it looked like. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. The credibility was never the hook. What separated Kentucky Ballistics from the hundreds of other firearms channels on the platform was not Scott's law enforcement background. It was the fact that he would shoot a jug of mustard with a weapon powerful enough to stop a vehicle. Condiment jugs, watermelons, ballistic gel dummies, pineapples. At one point, shotgun shells loaded with candy, which led to the discovery that, of all things, gummy bears fired from a shotgun can generate enough force to punch through a sternum. That is not a fact most people expect to learn from a YouTube video. That is exactly why they kept watching. Scott understood something that a lot of technically capable creators miss. Expertise alone does not make someone watchable. Personality does. He took his genuine knowledge of firearms and wrapped it in a presentation that felt like a guy doing something ridiculous in a field with his dad. Because that is, in fact, often exactly what it was. His father, Scott DeShields Sr., became a recurring presence, not as a co-host, just as someone who was always there, behind the camera, part of the operation. The channel grew, not explosively at first, but consistently. Scott's comedic instincts and genuine firearms knowledge created a combination that worked for audiences who wanted to be entertained and informed at the same time. The subscriber count climbed. The videos got more ambitious. The calibers got larger. By the early 2020s, Scott had built something real. He had walked away from law enforcement and was making content full-time. The channel had grown well past 1 million subscribers. He was running a private shooting range. He had a clothing brand. He had a Patreon. He was, by the metrics that matter in this space, doing exceptionally well. And then April 9, 2021 arrived, and if you think that was surprising, stay with me because this next part is why the whole story matters. It was a routine filming session. That is the part worth sitting with for a moment. Scott had done this kind of content dozens of times. He knew the Serbu RN50, a single-shot .50 caliber rifle, well. He had used it on camera before. What he did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that the military surplus SLAP ammunition he loaded that day had been compromised. SLAP stands for Saboted Light Armor Penetrator. It is high-velocity, armor-piercing military ammunition. The rounds he was using were old, surplus stock, and Scott noted on camera that some of them were behaving strangely, not hitting their trajectories the way they should. He kept going. The last round he chambered was, in his own words, extra hot. There was no way to see it, No way to measure it. He pulled the trigger. The gun exploded. The steel cap on the back of the RN-50, the part designed to contain the pressure of a tight 50 BMG round detonating, failed completely. It drove backward into Scott's face. The explosion sent a 1-inch fragment of metal through his neck. That fragment lacerated his jugular vein and punched a hole in his right lung. His right orbital bone broke in 3 places. His nose broke. His right eye went blind instantly from the impact. His index finger broke. His lung began filling with blood. His goggles flew off. His cap flew off. He went down. Scott DeShields Jr. was behind the camera. He had watched every second of it. What happened in the next few minutes is what actually kept Scott alive. His father immediately rushed to him. Scott, somehow conscious and thinking clearly enough to act, pressed his thumb into the hole in his neck to slow the bleeding. They did not wait for an ambulance. His father drove him to the nearest hospital at speed, while Scott kept his thumb in the wound the entire way. Doctors would later tell him that the decision to do that, to physically hold the wound closed with his hand, was the reason he survived the drive. The blood loss was already catastrophic. Most people, they said, would not have made it. At the local hospital, his right lung was intubated and drained while he was still conscious. Then he was sedated and life-flighted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. The trauma team there cut open his rib cage to remove the shrapnel, repair the lung, and repair the jugular vein. The surgery carried risks of stroke and continued hemorrhage. It was a success. Most people who know this story stop here. But the real story starts right now. 2 things could have happened after that. Scott could have walked away. He had spent years building something meaningful, and that thing had almost killed him. Nobody would have blamed him. He had a family, a history in law enforcement he could return to, other options. Walking away would have been the reasonable choice. He did not walk away. Within weeks of being released from the hospital, he was posting updates online. He was showing the scar. He was transparent about the recovery, the slow healing of his rib cage, the pins in his finger, the fatigue that hit him harder than anything he had experienced. He did not filter it or frame it as inspiration. He just showed people what it looked like. And he announced, without ambiguity, that Kentucky Ballistics was not ending. But something more interesting happened when the channel actually came back. The near-death experience changed what Scott made. Before April 9, 2021, Kentucky Ballistics was a channel that tested firearms. After that date, it became something more specific, a channel that deliberately engineers catastrophic firearm failures under controlled conditions and films them. The accident had given Scott a unique piece of knowledge. He understood exactly what happens when a gun fails at the worst possible moment. He had felt it, and instead of avoiding that knowledge, he built a content format around it. Post-2021, Scott brings guns specifically to failure points. He uses overloaded ammunition intentionally. He understands the mechanics of catastrophic malfunction in a way that very few people on the planet do, because he survived one. He controls the environment, positions the cameras correctly, and films the moments that most creators cannot film because they do not know how to recreate them safely. That format caught the attention of an audience well beyond the firearms community. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. The Slow-Mo guys, Gavin Free and Daniel Grucci, run one of the most subscribed science and technology channels on YouTube. Their format is built around filming things at extreme slow-motion frame rates, up to 187,000 frames per second in some cases, compared to the standard 24 or 30 frames per second in a normal video. They came to Kentucky. In April 2023, the Slow-Mo guys collaborated with Scott to film guns being deliberately exploded, exactly the controlled catastrophic failure format Scott had developed post-accident, at 187,000 frames per second. The video showed AR-15 and .300 Winchester Magnum failures in a level of visual detail that had never been captured before at that scale. They came back again in 2024, filming Scott's 4-bore rifle, a weapon that produces roughly 200 pounds of recoil per shot at 200,000 frames per second. Then again in November 2024 to film Scott's punt gun in action, a collaboration that ran across multiple videos. The Slow-Mo guys have tens of millions of subscribers across their channels. Their audience is not the firearms community. It is science enthusiasts, engineering fans, casual YouTube viewers who want to see physics happen in ways the human eye cannot normally process. Every one of those collaborations introduced Scott's channel to an audience that had never heard of Kentucky Ballistics. His subscriber count grew past 5 million. then passed 5.5 million. Total views crossed 1.1 billion. He launched Kentucky Ballistics Breakdowns in 2023, a separate channel where he discusses firearms with a more technical and serious tone, distinct from the main channel's personality-driven format. Kentucky Customs, his vehicle-focused channel with his father, continued operating. He now runs 3 separate channels simultaneously: the clothing brand, the Patreon, the private range, the Underwood ammo line that bears his name and his signature caliber. He built a multi-platform operation around a channel that started as a side project while he was working patrol shifts. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got until now. There is a detail in the Kentucky Ballistics story that gets skipped in almost every piece written about the accident. It changes how the whole thing reads. The viral video of the explosion, the actual footage of the RN50 failing and Scott going down, was filmed by his father. Scott DeShields Jr. was behind the camera for the worst moment of his son's life. He watched it through a viewfinder. He processed what he saw in real time, and then made the decision that saved his son. He moved fast, got Scott into a vehicle, and drove. That is not a small thing. There are 2 stories inside the Kentucky Ballistics accident. The story of what happened to Scott, which gets told everywhere, and the story of what it took for a father to keep filming, keep his composure, and then move with exactly the right urgency when the moment arrived. Scott has talked about his faith publicly and consistently since the accident. He has described the survival as something he cannot attribute to luck alone. The decision to press his thumb into the wound, the fact that his father was present and reacted correctly, the fact that the Vanderbilt trauma team was equipped to handle exactly that kind of catastrophic blood loss. He has said directly that he believes God is good. For an audience that skews toward rural, working-class, faith-adjacent viewers, that framing resonated in a way that went beyond subscriber metrics. It also changed what he talks about on camera. Post-2021, Scott occasionally breaks from the content format to acknowledge what he survived. Not constantly, not in a way that drives the channel, but it is present. The scar is present. There is a running bit on the channel now where, before shooting particularly sketchy weapons, he jokes that his neck scar starts tingling, a reference to what happened that most of his audience immediately understands: dark humor as processing mechanism. It works because it is real. One phone call, one conversation, that's all it took to change the direction of everything. In January 2025, Matt Carricker, the man behind Demolition Ranch, the largest firearms channel on YouTube, with over 11 million subscribers, announced he was retiring from content creation to spend more time with his family. Demolition Ranch had been the dominant force in gun YouTube for over a decade. When Carricker stepped away, he also began selling off the channel's firearms collection. Scott DeShields bought some of those guns. He made a video about it. The title was direct: "I bought Matt's guns." It was not a gimmick. It was a genuine acknowledgement that a chapter in the world of firearms YouTube was closing, and that the creators who remained, including Scott, were the ones who would carry that space forward. It was a moment that the firearms community noticed. Demolition Ranch had 11 million subscribers built over more than a decade. Kentucky Ballistics had crossed 5.5 million. In a niche that had just lost its biggest name, Scott's channel was one of the few that had the audience, the credibility, and the content identity to absorb that gap. The channel he had built while working double shifts in law enforcement, the channel that survived a near-fatal explosion, the channel that transformed its worst day into its most distinctive content format. That channel was now one of the flagship operations in the space. And if you think that was surprising, the final chapter of this story is the part most people missed entirely. As of 2026, Kentucky Ballistics is still uploading. That sounds like a simple statement. It is not. Most channels that experience the kind of trauma Scott went through in April 2021 do not survive it. The ones that do survive it rarely grow through it. Kentucky Ballistics did both. The channel has crossed 1.1 billion total views. It runs at an average video length of around 17 minutes, with genuine engagement across a predominantly adult male audience that has followed the channel's evolution from weekend hobbyist cop with a camera to multi-platform media operation. The Slow-Mo Guys collaborations are still ongoing. The Breakdowns channel provides a space for audiences who want the technical depth without the entertainment framing. The clothing line and Patreon fund the operation's independence from pure AdSense revenue. Scott still films on the private range in Kentucky. His father is still around. The scar is still there. The channel still tests the largest guns available, and several that are essentially impossible to source anywhere else: anti-tank rifles, 4-bore elephant guns, punt guns that fire 1-pound lead balls, because Scott has spent 15 years building the relationships, the resources, and the collection that makes those videos possible. Most creators in his position would have done what seems safest. Scott DeShields Jr. has never once appeared to be interested in what seems safest. The question that drove this whole story, what really happened to Kentucky Ballistics, has an answer that the title does not fully contain. What happened was not a tragedy. What happened was an accident that almost ended a life, and instead became the thing that clarified what that life was actually building toward. Scott DeShields started Kentucky Ballistics as a side project and ended up building one of the most viewed firearms channels in the history of the platform, not by playing it safe, but by doing the opposite every single time the option to play it safe presented itself. He walked away from law enforcement when the channel demanded it. He returned to YouTube when most people would have walked away from YouTube. He turned a near-fatal accident into a content format that attracted 1 billion views. And when the biggest gun channel on the platform retired, he was one of the few left standing with the audience and the credibility to absorb what that left behind. His next chapter is already underway. New videos, new collaborations, the Breakdowns channel growing its own audience, and a collection of firearms that most ranges will never see. Kentucky Ballistics is not finished. If anything, the last 4 years suggest it is only getting started. So here is the question worth leaving in the comments. Scott survived the worst day of his career and built something bigger on the other side of it. If that had been you, would you have come back?